Okay. Okay, I think we're ready to go. All right, so the topic that I chose for today is protecting water quality in the Red Cedar watershed. So I thought I would share with you some of the work that we have done in the Red Cedar, but then have a broader discussion about the types of best management practices and the things that we are looking at in terms of water quality. And that's real, that extends way beyond the Red Cedar. It's just for any type of watershed that we might be working in. So, so let me hop right into it. And like I said, if you have questions as we go, feel free to ask. And I'm trying to decide which screen to look at. So of course, we are talking about our local watersheds here that you can see in the shaded portion of this picture. And that is what we typically refer to as the kind of the middle Grand watershed. So the upper Grand is here to the south of us, and then right here is the city of Lansing and Michigan State University. So we are in the urbanized portion of the Red Cedar River watershed. So I want to point out, so we've got the Grand River, we've got the upper Grand here, and I should have brought my pointer. I don't have my pointer with me. The Red Cedar River watershed here, and then the Looking Glass to the north of us. And then that all heads out eventually to Lake Michigan at Grand Haven. So you will notice that I have some shaded portions of these watersheds here. And the shaded portions on this map are what we refer to as the urbanized watershed. And that's based on population and population density. And that's important because we address water quality in urbanized areas quite differently than we do in the more rural or suburban areas. And that is actually under permit. It's permitted under the Clean Water Act. And I'll talk some more about that. So that's the urbanized portions of our watersheds where we have
Waldemar on there.
Waldemar would be here. What do you all think, Fred? Fred, like right over here somewhere?
South there.
Right over here somewhere? In the kind of middle upper Grand, I guess is what we refer to that. So this is the Red Cedar water. Oops, this is the Red Cedar River watershed. Michigan State, there's my little Spartan helmet right here. We're right at the downstream portion of the Red Cedar. So this watershed actually begins in Livingston County with this series of wetlands and lakes, Cedar Lake, and it extends in a northwesterly direction. This is the Red Cedar River, about 50 miles or so, where it meets the Grand River, just past Potter Park Zoo. So, and there are lots of little tributaries and sub-watersheds that are feeding into that main portion of the river. And so if we look at a land use map, we can see this, the red is showing the urbanized portions of this Red Cedar River watershed, and where we have cities and more populated areas. And there's a lot of cropland and a lot of farmland in the headwaters portions of the river. So excuse me for a second. I see that I have a couple of chat. Can you not see the screen, Paul?
No, I can't. I just see everybody. I'm on Liz Harrow's video, and all I see is people eating lunch.
Okay, so stop the share and then go back and share.
But Kate says she can see the screen, so I don't think it perhaps is from our end. Paul, can you do a yeah, so it can be seen. I think it might be what you're looking at, Paul, your view.
Oh, maybe.
Okay, Amanda says she can see it too. I got myself on there, but don't need to do that. I've just got the there. No, it popped up for a minute, and okay, and when I touch it to enlarge it, it goes away. Oh well, I can see that. I can see it's a problem with me operating it. So go ahead.
Keep pushing buttons and maybe we'll
right.
eventually get it. Okay, so the Red Cedar River watershed is about 460 square miles and 300,000 acres. So this is a large watershed. And we do have some water quality issues in the watershed, which I'll talk about. But here's an interesting thing that I want to point out to you, and that is all of the local units of government that play some kind of role in things that could influence water, you know, making land use decisions. We have townships, we have villages and cities and counties that all have to, you know, play some kind of role in terms of water resources management, water resources protection. And that is really the concept behind watershed planning. For those of you who don't come from a water background, obviously, we know that water doesn't understand our political boundaries. And if we really want to do a decent job of managing our water resources, we have to acknowledge that we have all of these local units of government that are making land use decisions. So what is it? What can we do as water resources managers and as township officials or local government officials to make sure that we're making decisions, making land use decisions that make sense in terms of water resources. So why, why else do we do watershed planning? Well, this is, you probably have seen pictures of this. I like to always start out the beginning of semester, which our classes start next week with my students, with this picture. So this, of course, is the Cuyahoga River that caught fire numerous times prior to passage of the Clean Water Act. I mean, we were truly the wild, wild west back then, guys. I mean, anything, we saw rivers as a way to, you know, as a nice place to locate our factories or industries because it was convenient for, you know, getting rid of our waste. And we really didn't have any regulations at that time regarding discharges to our waterways. And thus we had fires like on the Cuyahoga River. For those of you who know Bob Shireman, Bob from East Lansing, who recently retired, he said he was a graduate student during one of these events on the Cuyahoga, and he and his buddies went down to watch the river burn, and they were joking about roasting hot dogs on the fire. And I told my students that, and they thought I was serious. So I have to be careful about the jokes. Be careful about the jokes that you tell the undergraduates, because they might not think they're jokes. So
Time window?
what's that?
So what's the time?
Yeah, before in the 1960s. Yeah, before 1972. So
I was mid-70s, yeah, just before.
do you remember any of the?
It happened before I got there.
Okay, all right, gotcha.
But yeah, it was still high on the news.
Yeah.
The
And
river catches on fire, my God.
yeah, it's crazy to think of, right? So Time magazine at that time, it had they said this: the river oozes rather than flows, a place where a person does not drown but decays. Think about that in terms of our water resources. I think
I'm eating.
we tend to be a little bit spoiled because we haven't had to, you know, have to see that, most of us, in our lifetime. Now, if any of you have seen Pat Lindeman talk, which I hope you have because he's wonderful, he has absolutely shown you this picture. And this is a picture of the Red Cedar River in the mid 1960s. So we're standing on the Farm Lane Bridge, looking downstream. So to the right here is Bessie Hall, which is now includes MSU bikes, the bike rental. And in the old days, guys, we used to rent canoes, which is kind of cool. And there's kind of been a push for how could we bring that back? But the point of this picture, this is an old picture from the Institute of Water Research Archives, which is one of my home units at the university, is we didn't have regulations. This was before we passed the Clean Water Act. And, you know, what do you think about how that river looks? That's pretty disgusting. And I used to show this picture a lot to alumni groups, and they would say, yes, I remember when you could walk across the river in the wintertime and the summertime, because it was so gross. And Pat, when he shows this picture, always jokes about the people in this canoe. And he says, what is this? This guy's got this girl on a date and he's wearing a white shirt, and look at that lovely river for a date day on the canoe.
And the story, I think, was that if you fell in the Red Sea, you should go get a penicillin
A
shot.
tetanus shot. And I still, you know, it's kind of interesting because those misconceptions, they stay alive
Yeah,
down through the
right,
generations. So when I often ask my students at the beginning of the semester, what do you think about the red cedar? And they say, it's it's the dead sewer. It's, you know, they have all kinds of nicknames because that's what their grandparents told them. And then that's what their parents told them. So slowly we're trying to change misconceptions about the river. So yeah, so that was mid 1960s. And of course, this is a shot from the same vantage point today. So we've made a lot of progress in terms of water quality on not just the red cedar, but most of our surface water supplies. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with water resources issues, we tend to separate pollutant sources into what we call point sources and non-point sources of pollution. The point sources are just like they sound, it's end of pipe discharges. So from a factory, from a wastewater treatment plant or water resources recovery plant, that's
We had houses downtown Wakusa. They were running street pipes. to the
that
river.
would be a that would be a point source. And that is, we're going to talk about septics in a little bit. So these are the easy to identify discharges into the water. Most of the point sources, except for the ones that we find out, you know, these illicit discharges, are now permitted as part of the Clean Water Act. All other pollutant sources are lumped into this category that we call non-point source pollution. So it's basically everything else that we do on the landscape that could impact water. So septic systems and fertilizer and pesticide use and everything else that you can think of. So point source and non-point source of pollution. So
I don't
what,
understand non-point sources.
okay.
How are they different from point sources? I mean, obviously,
Mhm.
factories pollute more and
Yep.
putting chemicals on.
I think the biggest problem, it is difficult to identify where the pollution is coming from.
Okay.
So when you have an end of pipe, you say, oh, yes, that is the, you know, wastewater treatment plant, and they are discharging their treated water at that pipe. But when you have, say, phosphorus loading to a river, is it coming from the farm fields, and which farm fields? Is it coming from local lawns and lawn care? So it's much more difficult to identify and then to control. So non-point source pollution management is a huge challenge. Yeah. Just because of the, you know, the broad, you know, sources, and then depending on the size of the watershed, like the red cedar, that's a big area to try to manage. So a couple of other concepts for you. We're going to talk a fair amount about bacteria today, or E. coli, because that is something that we're concerned about in the Red Cedar River. So Michigan has water quality standards for surface water supplies for a whole bunch of different contaminants, and bacteria is one of them. And so our standards for E. coli, we use E. coli as an indicator of bacterial contamination, is we do not want amounts higher than 1,000 colony forming units of E. coli per 100 mils of water for what we call partial body contact recreation. And what we mean by that is, for those of you who are canoers or kayakers, and you're in the river and you might dip a toe in or put a hand in the water, that is we want the E. coli levels to be below 1,000. Now for total body contact, if you're going to dunk under, your head's going to go under, and there's a possibility that you could inhale the water, that number should be below 300 colony forming units of E. coli per 100 mils of water. And then we have a daily max as well, or a 30-day geomine for that as well. And the idea behind these standards is they're designed to protect human health. So those water quality standards for E. coli have been set for human health protection. So there were portions of the Red Cedar that are not meeting these standards. That's really the kind of the gist of it. And in the Clean Water Act, the Clean Water Act is a huge sweeping piece of legislation that was responsible for those pictures, you know, cleaning up our burning rivers and our gross red cedar. So in the Clean Water Act, there's a little section, a large section called Section 303D, that requires states to submit every other year to the Environmental Protection Agency a list of our water resources that are not meeting designated uses, and because of these different pollutants, and such as bacteria. And so once that a water body goes on the section 303D list, and you'll find that water people have a ton of acronyms, and we speak, and so we'll just be talking about 303D and section 319 of the Clean Water Act, and we forget that that sounds like gibberish to most people. But basically what happens is if we have a water body that's not meeting standards, then something called a total maximum daily load has to be established for that water body, a TMDL. And so we have TMDLs for phosphorus, and we have all different types of pollutants. Well, we have a TMDL for bacteria on the red cedar. It's a little bit different because it's a concentration-based TMDL because of this standard. So we want the numbers to be below 1,000 and for partial body and 300 for total body contact. So a total maximum daily load, if that sounds strange to you, what that is the maximum amount of a pollutant that the water body can receive and still meet the water quality standards. So this equation, this fancy looking equation, all that means is that it's the point sources and the non-point sources and a background loading or a baseline level and a margin of safety. And I have that described on this slide here. So what is the load allocation that's coming from all of the point sources, the point source discharges? What do we think is coming in from the non-point sources? And we're going to talk about what those sources might be for bacteria, and then what might be background and what kind of margin of safety would we put on there. So we have a TMDL for bacteria on portions of the Red Cedar River and portions of the Middle Grand.
Is this stricter than the Clean Water Act or not?
It's following the Clean Water Act. It is parallel. That's what we're trying to meet. So when we did the Red Cedar River watershed plan way back in 2015, I think it was when we got it approved, we did a fair amount of water quality monitoring for E. coli. All of those highlighted portions, those colored portions of this watershed are areas where we have an E. coli TMDL. And what that means is we have gone out, we have sampled, and we have seen at least at one sampling point levels that were above that maximum at some point in time. So I guess I just want to emphasize that this isn't necessarily unusual for a watershed that has a lot of agricultural land, that has a lot of urbanized land. So I don't want you to come away from this thinking, oh my gosh, what the heck are we doing? And it's not all of the time. It ebbs and flows depending on the amount of rainfall that we have in the watershed. But the point is, we do have TMDLs, TMDL identified sub-watersheds for bacteria in the Red Cedar River. I just grabbed this. Now we work with the Ingham County Health Department. Do we have any health department people here today? They, all of the communities, Michigan State, East Lansing, City of Lansing, there's a whole bunch of us. We pool our money, and the Ingham County Health Department takes samples for E. coli across the Red Cedar and portions of the Grand River through the recreation season. So these results are from 2020 at the Farm Lane Bridge. That's one of their sampling points. And you can see I have the 300 level there on the red dotted line, that we do have periods where we're popping above that 300, that total body contact recreation number of 300. So yes, we have periodic elevated bacteria in the Red Cedar River. So let's talk about, where's it coming from? So I'm going to ask you, where would bacteria be coming from? What do you think are some of the sources?
Agriculture.
Okay, so if we have animal ag.
CSO.
Okay, so combined sewer overflows. We will talk some more about that.
Residential.
With residential, septic systems, on-site wastewater treatment. So-
Single family versus multi, is there a
Could be, there could be.
market difference between those? Two?
It just has to be operating properly. Yep. Others? Can you think of any others?
I
What that
heard
would be?
once that dog food was a problem.
Absolutely. So waterfowl is a huge issue and wildlife. So city of Lansing, they were having a huge issue with raccoons in their discharge pipes. So I think we hit most of them. So failing septic systems, and we'll talk some more about that. Improper manure management, wildlife, waterfowl, pet waste, sewer overflows, stormwater. You guys,
Wasn't there a body found in the Red Cedar River?
probably at some point in time. Yeah, actually there was. Historically, every once in a while, we run into a problem, unfortunately, like that. That wouldn't be something that would be, if we're working on watershed planning, we're really looking at these ongoing sources of pollutants. So let's talk a little bit now. I'm going to go into, so this is where it's coming from. That's a whole bunch of diffuse sources of bacteria. And I want to talk about, yeah, for sure.
When you were on the previous slide, you said the county is monitoring the E. coli level.
Yeah.
Do they post that like on the?
Yeah, that's a
website?
great question. So if you didn't hear online, the question is, do those monitoring results get posted? And they do. They're on the Ingham County Health Department website. It's called their surface water sampling program. The problem is it's the identifiers for the locations are kind of goofy. They're not really easy necessarily to understand where the samples are being taken. We've been having some conversations with a bunch of different people about how we can get that more user friendly. So you could click on a map and say, okay, if I'm going kayaking, what are the bacteria levels on this portion of the river? But they do upload, and those are weekly samples. They go out on the same day every week. Now, ideally, guys, if we're doing water sampling, we would like to go out after a big rain event, because then you're really going to see what is the impact of the landscape. But that's not really feasible for an ongoing monitoring program. So they go out once a week at the same time and take the sample from different sites. Okay, so I want to talk about types of best management practices that we could put into place. And so we'll start with ag land. Now, frankly, we haven't done a lot of concerted management efforts in the agricultural portion of the Red Cedar River watershed. I'm not saying there aren't good things happening. We just haven't been able to garner grant support for BMP implementation at a watershed scale in the Red Cedar. And there are a number of reasons for that. And primarily, we just don't have the good service provider connections with the landowners. We don't really have super good working relationships with our agencies and the people who live in the watershed. So I'm not saying that the farmers aren't doing this. I'm just saying that we haven't gotten watershed money to do it on a coordinated basis. But these are the types of BMPs, and these are not just for bacteria. These are for addressing nutrient loading, like phosphorus and nitrogen from ag land, as well as manure. So, and some of these you're probably familiar with. So we can incorporate manure. We can look at manure management. How is the manure being handled? Especially if we've got large farms. And we do have a couple of concentrated animal feeding operations in the Red Cedar River watershed. Those are based on number of animals. So I think it's like more than 700 cows. It depends on the species. So those are like farms that have a lot of animals and not necessarily a ton of land to apply the manure. So that's where we're really concerned about bacteria loading from these large. There are some counties and some watersheds that have a ton of CAPOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. So manure management is absolutely critical, proper manure management. So incorporation of manure, proper manure storage and lagoons, having, covered storage, things like that are the things that we would look at. But, the other things that we've talked about for many, many years are things like buffer strips. So putting an area of vegetation between the field and the drain, the farm drain, or low till or no till, where you actually plant the crop on the previous year's stubble so that you're not disturbing the land and creating erosion and runoff and the soil taking any pollutants that are attached to it. those are the ones that we tend to think about when we say agricultural best management practices. We've been doing them for many years. But there's a lot of really cool research going on right now. There's a lot of faculty members in our biosystems and ag engineering department at MSU that are working on what we kind of collectively refer to as drainage water management. So for those of you who don't have a farming background or haven't thought about this, the reason we can farm so much land in Michigan is because our land is tiled. Our ag land, a good portion of our ag land has tile drainage, which means that the water goes down from the field into a perforated pipe system and then discharges into a farm drain that looks, might look something like this into a drain. And that's, Paul Pratt's on the line, Paul and Pat Lindeman. Their office is, they're doing the job of keeping those maintained and keeping those up. So the farm land that is draining to these drainage ditches, drainage water management is saying, the research is saying we can control, there are things that we can do to look at how we can manage the water that's coming out of those pipes. So we have things like level control structures. So after harvest, we can change we can control the discharge through these different types of structures so that we're not getting discharge all at once after a rain event, for example. So that's one thing. The concept of saturated buffers, we're researching that. So rather than putting a buffer strip, a vegetated strip at the edge of the field, we would actually direct the flow of water from that field into another series of perforated pipes so that this whole land area is saturated before that water hits the drainage ditch. Is that making sense? So you're not just thinking about runoff, topical runoff, you're also saturating the soil, allowing the soil to treat that water. So saturated buffers.
So that block there was like a catch basin.
Yeah, well, it's directing the water. It's directing the water to somewhere else. And then using things like wood chip bioreactors. So you're putting the water through wood chips to denitrify the water. There's a lot of research going on with that. I guess those are the only pictures. There are other things like 2-stage or 3-stage ditches where we would use an excavator and level out the land toward that drainage ditch to allow the water flow to decrease and infiltrate before it's hitting the agricultural drain. So all of these things, there's a ton of work going on in the Western Lake Erie Basin. Right now, a lot of my colleagues are working where we have all of the nutrient loading issues right now in Lake Erie. Right. They are working with farmers to look at this. Where is the phosphorus loading coming from, and what things like this can we put into place in Western Lake Erie, the Maumee River watershed and the Raisin River watershed to decrease nutrients.
Listen, MSU is an ag school. It's got a dairy teaching facility and a cattle feeding facility and a soil teaching facility and fowl and pork and chickens. Not to mention the golf course and the landscaping for maintenance. There's a lot of chemicals go into lawns.
Oh, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about our best management practices on campus.
Yeah.
Is that what you're getting at? Yep, for sure. And we are addressing that. And we'll talk about that in just a moment when we get to stormwater, but very good point. Yeah.
So this will tell you how little I know about farming. Why is it we need to drain farmland? Is it because it's in floodplain? Is it because there's so many chemicals put
So
on?
if you, that's a very fair question. If you look at, what do we call that? Fred? It's a
You
pre-development.
raise the crop, you
pre-settlement.
harvest it, and then next year you plant it.
That's a very fair question. But if you look at pre-settlement maps of the state of Michigan, who can tell me what Michigan used to look like? We're a swamp. We're
Michigan
Guessing
is
this is-
forested with wetlands.
This one.
Yeah, so we would not be able to farm the land if we didn't drain.
So this is maintenance.
It would be,
Because
we
we're,
would, yeah.
in one sense, we're improperly located because we're forcing it to be something that wasn't original.
Yeah, that's one way to look at
Okay.
it. We wouldn't be able to farm it if we didn't drain it, but that's a fair question, for sure.
If the phosphorus, whatever it is, goes into the soil, doesn't it eventually end up? in
Yeah, so
the-
that's, that the other, I don't know how much like detail we want to get into.
No,
It's
you
a
don't
really
have to do a lot,
interesting
but-
question. In the old days, and some of you probably remember this, those of you who have worked in water, we always used to say, when I would do a workshop, phosphorus is a soil issue. If we control erosion and we don't get the soil moving off the land, we'll control the phosphorus because it was particulate phosphorus that we were worried about. It was runoff. Phosphorus was a runoff issue. Nitrogen was an infiltration groundwater issue. Well, now in Lake Erie, this is where this is all coming from. All of these discussions, we're realizing that dissolved reactive phosphorus is getting down into the soil profile, into the groundwater. And so we have to look at both runoff and infiltration of phosphorus sources.
And does
So-
that cause the algae?
Yeah, it does. And it's the bioavailability of the bioreactive phosphorus. It's directly available for plant uptake. Yeah, so that is something that is like hot and heavy being researched right now.
And I don't want to interrupt. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah. I didn't want to prolong it too much either, but we had a speaker a couple of years ago from Ann Arbor who talked about, she was working on water stuff like this, and she interfaced with farmers, and she did not see them as the enemies. She said, they're exhausted. A
Oh,
lot of them are doing what was
Mhm.
the best practice 5 years ago, and they put a lot of money into it. And now we've told, it turns out, we want you to spend another $1 million on the new thing. And so when you said
Yeah.
that thing about the phosphate and so forth, it's like, they learn, you learn something when you're 20, and then you keep. on
Well,
looking at
so
it.
but that's an interesting discussion, the whole phosphorus issue. We pushed no-till and low-till practices. And then now with all of the studies that have been done in the Western Lake Erie Basin, we're saying, you know what? The low-till and the no-till might actually be increasing the dissolved reactive phosphorus.
I was just going to quickly mention Michigan Agribusiness Association, which is a big industry trade group. You think they'd be kind of resistant to some of this, but they're very supportive.
Mhm.
And I'm attending their convention next week, or the annual
Mhm.
meeting. And they always bring in MSU presenters, researchers talking about these cutting edge
Oh, yeah.
techniques. I've heard Tim Boring, one of your
Mhm.
colleagues, all of the different factors, like you're talking about, the different ways to mitigate soluble and not dissolved nitrogen versus phosphorus, all of the different factors that
Yeah.
you guys are researching.
Yeah.
It's not as clear cut as one would think, like just filter strips, buffer strips, it's not the answer.
Yeah, that's right. And we're finally realizing that. Yeah, we absolutely, there's so much cool stuff happening from the ag side of things. So, and all of this research is informing the work that they're doing, which is cool. Any other questions before we move on?
I just want to say one thing. We have a speaker coming up in a different group, I think, about regenerative agriculture.
Mm,
And apparently in that, you don't need all the stuff that Ukraine gives us for fertilizer. Because they just have the animals poop on the ground and then move them around continually. That grows up weeds and all that, and then we'll come back years later.
mhm.
You don't need all that.
Several of my colleagues are actually working on, maintain grazing. I think the bigger question though is, in which we don't have time to get into, but like what do we eat? What is our demand for meat and milk, and how do we provide that what the consumers are
The
demanding?
quantity of stuff we need, and can you
Yeah.
do it with homegrown methods?
Absolutely. So those are some really big philosophical discussions that, that we have to have as a country.
Yeah, and the tradition of using any convenient body of water to dump your junk. It's been a very long history, and there was just an article on, a report on BBC this morning about cigarette butts
Mm,
and all the poisons in them,
mhm.
and leave them laying on the ground, it's gonna get.
If you talk to Denny would know, cigarette butts and catch basins. I mean, it probably still is. It was like terrible. Yeah, just a terrible problem. Yeah, for sure. Any other questions? All right, so I want to talk a little bit about on-site wastewater treatment and septic systems, because that absolutely is a source of bacteria. And it's a big deal in Michigan. Does anyone know what the issue is with septics in Michigan? What is our problem?
Work.
Well, we do have some
They're not
problems.
requiring certification on sale.
Okay, so we don't have, the upshot is we do not have a statewide code for septic, for on-site wastewater treatment. So each county health department does their own thing. Now they do well in septic inspections, but we really only have, I don't know what the total is now, not very many time of sale programs. Time of sale toast programs. Yeah, toast programs. Where if you sold your house, you would have to have a well and septic inspection and say, yes, this is working, and you can't complete the sale until it's been.
The pity is that everybody that's required it, and actually the realtors, everybody loves it. Because it's like title insurance.
Not everybody,
Well-
because Barry Eaton had one for 10 years and it was.
Look, we're Ottawa County too.
So,
Is that you?
yeah,
Are you? No, okay.
There's also some money available, but it goes to like people that are so far over the poverty line, you know, and it's not even enough money
yeah.
to fix.
So that is a huge issue because it's estimated, the numbers are vary, but maybe 20 to 25% of on-site wastewater treatment systems are not operating properly in the state of Michigan. So, or they haven't been maintained. Joan Rose, for those of you who know Dr. Rose at MSU, she's in fisheries and wildlife. She's a world-renowned water resources researcher and microbiologist. And she had a PhD student who did a study of water bodies across Michigan, and they found human impact almost everywhere they sampled. So we know that our waste is making its way into our water supplies. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept of on-site, how many of you have a septic system? Maybe I better ask that first.
I just bought a property and we couldn't use the septic system. They said because it hadn't been maintained for a while.
Okay.
Some of it was ingrown with roots.
Okay.
So I had to.
And it's right in the middle of the city. of East
Yeah,
Hampton, so it
I
shouldn't
had
be-
to get
Oh.
a different septic
Oh.
system put in for $20,000. And not a septic,
A connection to the wastewater.
It had go under the drainage ditch up. the-
Oh, wow. Lucky you. Oh, boy. So not very many have their own.
So I have a property.
Oh, okay, so a handful. The challenge is like when people who have grown up and been accustomed to municipal drinking water and wastewater, then they buy a property that has a septic system. It's a big shock, right? What the heck is this? And I always tell my students the story about man who bought a house in a subdivision, and he put on this super fancy, ultra expensive deck. And I don't know, it was like $20,000 or $30,000. And he invited the neighbor over to show off his fancy deck. And the neighbor said, that's really cool, but what about your septic tank? And he's like, I don't have a septic system. And he said, yeah, you do. Everyone in this neighborhood does. So he had built it over the top of the septic tank. Didn't even know.
Say it was under his deck, right?
Yeah, it was under his deck. Inaccessible at that point. So the idea with on-site wastewater for houses that are not near a municipal system is that we use the soil to treat the water. So the water comes from our household and goes into what we might refer to as pre-treatment, which is the tank itself. That separates out the solids, the scum rises to the top, and the liquids then go out into the drain field. And then those liquids are allowed to go through the soil treats the water before it hits the groundwater. And so if we look at an up close of the tank itself, and there are different sizes, it's based on numbers of bedrooms, how big the house is. But the idea in the tank is that the solids, the poop sinks to the bottom. We always have a scum layer, that's grease and hair, anything that's floatable. And then this liquid would be what goes out to the field, the drain field. The problem is people who don't understand septics think that it works like a municipal supply and you can just flush anything. You cannot. The only thing that should be going into a septic tank is what?
Where's?
Pee, poop, and toilet paper. That is it. Nothing else should be going into that tank. There's nowhere for it to go.
Right.
So what happens is and eventually, now this is anaerobic. There's bacteria in there and they're eating away at those solids and they do a pretty good job. But eventually those solids build up and they have to be pumped. So these septic tanks have to be pumped on a regular basis. And that's the crux of the problem. A lot of people don't realize that. They don't understand that they're responsible for that upkeep. So what happens, this is what tanks might look like. I think I threw a picture. This is my septic tank when I just got it pumped last spring. Kind of ugly, but they do the job if you maintain them. The challenge is when we flush things or put things into the drain that shouldn't be there. So we shouldn't be using a large amount of, it's not like you want to shove all your potato peels down there and use your garbage disposal. So we have to encourage people to compost. Oh, you really shouldn't be using garbage disposal on a septic system, frankly. We don't want to put a water softener brine that should be going out to a separate dry well to the outside of the house. Certainly don't want to be dumping any chemicals or anything else, any sanitary products, condoms, anything like that, because like I said, all that's going to do is plug up the system. And I talk a lot in my classes about this issue of flushable wipes. Fred knows this. I mean, MWEA for how long we've been talking about the problem with flushable wipes. Sure, they'll flush because you flush the toilet and it goes away. You don't see it in the toilet bowl. But let me show you some pictures. So this is from the Twitter feed of the Northeast Region Ohio Sewer District. They got a great Twitter feed for those of you who are looking for a fun follow. They put a cleaning wipe in water and toilet paper and water. And I grabbed this was just from like last year. And so these things are not designed to break down like toilet paper.
The plumber at the nursing home my mother lived was just always on the case of these things, and that was for a plumbing system.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just septic systems. The municipal systems, these are just some examples of what these our poor, municipal systems are dealing with. It's those wipes plug up the equipment. And I don't know if any of you remember this, Macomb County in 2018 had that big old fatberg that they discovered. They were doing their televising and cleaning of their system, and they came up with this great big huge, like what they call it, a fatberg of this collection of wipes and grease and oil that had to be removed. And they actually put this on a sample on display in the Michigan Science Center in Detroit. When I first heard that, like they put that whole fatberg. I used to say, we were just talking about those e-scooters. I used to say, because we're always pulling bikes out of the river, put them on display in some big mountain, make it a piece of art. So everybody has to walk by all those bikes we pull out of the river. So we could do that with a fatberg too. Just put the fatberg on display. Yeah.
What do they do with it once it's removed?
Yeah, it's landfill. Yeah, you have to landfill it. Yeah, there's really not much else you can do with it. So
So
go ahead.
Here's an extreme thought, just to get a perspective on this. Suppose all the toilets were replaced by composting toilets, which has been in state law since '81. So
Do any of you have a
what would be
composting?
the impact? Would it be large, small?
That's a good question. I have no idea.
Now, having said that, the law requires that you also have a regular toilet before you can put in the
Gotcha.
which is.
Do you have a
I believe there may be a
composting?
little political action.
Do you have a composting toilet? I would be
No, I don't.
interested
I
in
know
hearing.
people who do,
Okay.
but yeah, I mean, it's no more different than any other kind of toilet. You just get,
Mhm.
you just learn a new routine, just like you do with a regular toilet.
Well,
Which
it's
if you
like
don't
you're
follow the
breathing on the septic
routine,
tank,
it
right?
doesn't function either, as you're pointing out.
Yeah, right.
Are the garbage disposals also bad for the,
Yeah, because you really shouldn't be, for municipal supplies. I don't think it's not as much of a problem,
okay.
because they're able to handle more volume.
Oh.
Yeah.
I don't want to, but I'm gonna, I did a women's center for a group, they ended up buying a house that had been designed for a family of 4, and it had a garbage disposal. And we wanted to have 12 people sleeping in the house. All I had to do was take out the garbage disposal, and then I could add 4 bedrooms to this house. That garbage disposal equaled 8 showers,
Interesting.
8 toilets, whatever. I mean, it was since then, I've never put a garbage disposal in any project that I
Really
did.
interesting.
Do they have a compost bin there?
Yeah, well, I mean, even if they put in the waste, in the, you know,
Right.
in the dirt, in the
Interesting.
land.
Okay, so in the time we have left, I want to make sure that we address stormwater in those urbanized areas. Remember way back to the beginning, I showed you those shaded areas. So we are under permit for our stormwater. And I want to explain, one of you mentioned combined sewers. And for those of you who are not familiar with this concept, in the old days, when we put our sewer systems in place, we put one pipe that would handle our waste, our sanitary waste, toilets, showers, everything from our household, and the stormwater. When it would rain, it would go into one sewer. And that sewer water would go to the wastewater treatment plant and it would get treated and discharged back to the surface water supply. The problem with those combined sewers is that when you have a big rain event, the wastewater treatment plant or the water resource recovery facility cannot handle that volume. So we had overflow valves. And so what would happen in those combined systems during times of extreme rain is that you would have discharge of sanitary waste into our water bodies. So you could, walk along the red cedar at one point in time and see toilet paper hanging in the trees. That's because of the combined sewer overflow. So we have done a pretty good job of separating our wastewater and our stormwater, right? So now we still have areas of Lansing. There's East Lansing has pre-treatment, but there's still a little area
It's so cost beneficial to do so. To separate,
to separate them.
yeah, because then you're not treating
You're
all
not
the
treating all that.
stormwater.
So we have separated systems now for the majority of our urbanized area, not all of it. But the problem is, we said, oh, you know what? The stormwater really isn't that clean. Now what do we do? So all of the stormwater discharge is now under permit, under Clean Water Act permit. And so if this is not making sense to you, what's the difference between these two? What's the difference between the one on the left and one on the right?
One's a circle and one's a rectangle.
That's the answer. Okay, so storm drains lead to surface water and sanitary sewers lead to the wastewater treatment plants. That's the difference between the two. So when you see a catch basin along the roadway, that's coming out in what we call an outfall of end of pipe. So all of these outfalls in the urbanized area have a permit on them. So we are under permit to make sure that that's as clean as it can be, that we're not contributing pollutants.
With climate change, you're getting so many massive rain events
Yeah,
that it's just
yeah,
crushing the system. There's no way you can design for that.
yeah. Now we're talking about infrastructure problems. That's a whole nother, you should bring somebody in to talk about infrastructure and climate change. I'm not that person,
So
but
I've got one
that's.
of those circular ones on a small lot that I own, and it's unfortunately it's positioned about 1.5 feet above the floor of the lot.
So it's not doing you much good.
Maybe it's access or something. I mean,
Sanitary manhole, that's a good thing.
Yeah,
It's
it's
a
just.
storm drain, then it's
Yeah,
not.
exactly.
But
Depends on where it
it's
goes.
circular, it looks
So,
just like the circle.
Let me show you this. This is an aerial photo of campus. I don't know, like mid 1930s. I circled the stadium so that you could see. And so here's the Red Cedar River. And then here is a more recent picture with the stadium circled. So what do you think is the water quality impacts from this land use to this land use in terms of stormwater runoff?
All from
It's all
the
impervious.
parking lot.
Yeah,
and-
buildings, roadways, parking lots, that's all going into the storm drains. So if you look at how our storm drain is drained, all of these blue lines are that infrastructure, storm infrastructure. So the water goes into the catch basins, hits one of those lines, and then eventually discharges into the river. So in the greater Lansing region, what you're seeing on this screen is all of the communities and institutions that have stormwater permits to manage the water that's coming out of those outfalls. So we are all under permit for our stormwater discharges. And what that means is we have to do a lot of different things to ensure that that water coming out of those outfalls is as clean as possible. And that's getting at your question from earlier, ma'am, like what, how are we managing our landscaping on the MSU campus? Where are we washing our vehicles? Where, what are we doing to make sure that our stormwater is clean?
So a long time ago, I did a project in DeWitt. And they did an addition, they added parking, and we were required to make the flow of water off that site
Yes,
equal to what it was before.
yes.
Do all of those towns that you're talking about have the same rule?
Yes,
Are they
that's what we call post-construction stormwater runoff.
Because I've never been stopped by that. And then the
So,
other town.
in
DeWitt was
the-
only one that was
Yeah,
that strict.
in the old days, when we put a new construction project out, a new development, we would curb and gutter and send the water to the nearest waterway.
Right.
And now with our stormwater management programs, we say, how can we manage the stormwater on site? How can we do source control? And so it's rain gardens, it's bioretention sites, it's green roofs, it's all that kind of stuff. We are getting away from porous pavement. We've had a lot, we're
Yeah.
having a lot of problems.
Horse pavement doesn't work.
It's not, we're just getting, it's breaking up. I think the state of Michigan had one. They tore those out. LCP tore out.
Well, Michigan State's recycling building, the salvage.
We just
thing.
tore it out.
Oh, wow.
Or I think it's come out. If it hasn't already, it's coming out because they're just breaking down. They're not working properly, unfortunately. But that's all part of the post-construction. So, yes, if you are doing a development project in one of these communities, there will be stormwater standards that you will have to meet. And the point is, we want to limit the amount of stormwater that's.
But it
coming
won't
out of
necessarily
those.
be net zero.
No,
Oh, okay.
Each community has their own
Ideally,
standards
then nothing should leave the property
in the best,
in the best,
In the best-
where it lands is where it stays.
absolutely, if you
I
could do
believe
it.
the drain commissioner requires like the first 2 inches of rainwater get treated. So you're not.
Yeah, so
basically
we
just
have,
dumping it in.
there's volume control and there's water quality control. Yep. So we use the, first flush and then we use like what would over a two, what is it? Fred, do you know the rain event? Fred's our stormwater guy here. But there are standards. There are specific, 2-year storm. So, but that's all part of the stormwater.
The best solution is either bioretention or rain garden, right?
It depends on the site. It
Uh-huh.
really depends on the site. If you're in an ultra urbanized area and you have a lot of clay soils, that might not work. So you might have to do, underground storage or something. So it just, it's very site specific.
I was gonna say, my son just designed a park in Birmingham, he does park design. And they did have to have the soil built up at one end and slowly go down toward the rain garden, but it had to be, it was more expensive to do it, but they said it was really important, so.
Mhm. And the other thing is, when we put these, what we call green infrastructure practices in, that's what we're talking about, green stormwater infrastructure. We have to make sure that we're maintaining them. So we have to think forward, think ahead, like who's gonna pay for the long-term maintenance of these practices.
And,
Yeah.
and another little thing that like Lansing Township fails to do, other cities maybe also, is they could actually change their zoning code so they don't require quite so much parking. They could do other things that actually require less paving. And there's a big push to reduce paving, and there are a lot of townships that just didn't get the memo.
Hmm.
And I'm working on a project in Lansing Township, and I'm really
Okay.
frustrated with it.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
All right, so here's just some pictures of that's the parking lot that is coming out or has come out at recycling. There's one of our green
Yeah.
roofs. There's one of our, we call these proprietary treatment systems. We have a bunch of different, for water quality treatment systems underground. And here's some of our educational signage. And there's our Fisheries and Wildlife Club students doing a river cleanup. We're doing a river restoration project along the Red Cedar over by the stadium.
What does that mean?
We're stabilizing the bank using native vegetation, and we got a grant to do one strip of it from Kalamazoo Bridge down, and now we're, I don't know,
Almost a
like
farm,
halfway.
almost a farmland, but
Yeah, we're getting started on the new
because
stuff.
this goes right by Beal, it's across the river.
Yep, across from Beal, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Frank was.
So
very-
I talked longer than I had planned
No,
on.
you
so
got
I-
interrupted a lot.
So that's what I have for just do my hair there.
So do you know what they did in Meridian Township for the last year? along Grand River? Were they separating things?
Oh, I don't actually know does anyone online know what that infrastructure project was along? Okemos Road?
The Grand River flooding on Grand River, raising Grand River.
Well,
Grand River,
River.
senior planner Meridian Township, Grand River Avenue, and then where you're talking about raised 24 inches to take most of the minor flooding events out of the picture. It's not gonna alleviate the major events,
Mhm.
but 80 to 90% of the flooding has been alleviated.
Exactly, Babcock Ranch in Florida is just like 20 miles from Fort Myers. Ian bounced off of them because it's a fully sustainable community that was designed that way. They didn't lose electricity, they didn't lose internet, their roads are sunk below grade, so the roads are stormwater. And they bounced off of them. It just bounced, and it was designed that way. It's all solar powered.
interesting.
My son and his family of 6 have a septic system,
Uh-huh.
and they take the plates with the organic waste on the plates, dinner, right into the dishwasher. Instead of a garbage disposal.
Oh,
Is that the best thing to
it
do?
doesn't sound like it. I don't know. I can't speak to that. That sounds kind of goofy, but I don't know. I don't think I would do that, but
So what's the biggest culprits are still payphones and farms, or are the biggest culprits, all of us little people, fertilizing and using lawnmowers and
Yeah,
so forth?
it's
All the
We're
above.
all-
all of the above, yeah.
The one thing to help farming is that it's just a measuring nutrient level, so that you add what you need, not anymore. That's help, but it's still.
All right, go ahead.
Just question, comment, like about, Canada. And how they don't let in Ottawa, for sure, they don't let anyone buy pesticides or fertilizer. Like even the lawn care companies can't even put anything down. What do you think of Michigan? I mean, it's a whole lobbying. effort.
Works for me.
Get going. I mean, that's another topic.
Yeah, that's another one of, a philosophical
Yeah.
discussion. Now, I will say, we have in Michigan, we do have a phosphorus fertilizer ban for residential
Right.
lawns unless they're being newly established, or there is a soil test that shows that
Sure.
phosphorus is needed. So that was
That's big help.
a big help. Yeah.
Yeah, that helps a
Yeah.
lot.
And I don't remember, you may have answered this, golf courses,
Mhm.
including MSU, but they're in the city of Lansing. There are a couple of golf courses that are right by
Waterways.
waterways.
Yeah.
And,
That's a
is
good
there-
question. And
Is
we,
there anything, because there's
yeah,
must be a golf department at MSU.
yeah, oh, yeah. So there's like
Greensman, I mean,
a whole program called the Michigan.
Historically, golf courses were a major source of phosphorus. pollution.
right,
But in the last 20, 30 years, most of the professional managers have gotten the memo, as someone said.
Did-
And so they're much better control of.
is that happening in Lansing? Do you know?
They're not managed by the city.
We're shut all down.
Private entity. Oh, it's managed by the.
And then I want to add too, that for many years, we had a program called the Michigan Turfgrass Environmental Stewardship Program
Yeah.
that many golf courses adopted environmental stewardship practices as part of that program, and those were incorporated into their operations.
Okay.
So there's a lot of good effort going on out there among the golf courses. I can't speak to each individual one. It would
Right.
be, individually based. Any other questions?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was nice speaking with all of you. Thanks for having me. Everybody good online? Are we good to disconnect? Okay, well, what is
This is just, if anyone doesn't already receive this, MDNR, Michigan Department of Natural Resources, has a really good newsletter. Every week it comes out on Friday. This and you put the address in, you should get that.
I didn't know that we still had that name.
Florida. They designed it, and he bounced off of them.
And
They love
let's
to
give
go-
Liz a hand for all the.
Yeah.
But coffee most.
Because I'm there. Oh, right, yeah. Right. But I'm. I do. You can go online. Yeah, it's all federally. I'm working now. Well, they took everything. They did a little- This is fantastic. Thank God.
Yeah.
Oh, I got it.
Good seeing you, Ruth.
I'm so, we got to see each other.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah.